Can't decide and torn between a romantic, comedy, action, or an indie film to watch for the weekend? Well. Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast is your ultimate guide to the latest movies. Join us as we dissect the latest on the blockbusters. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast.
Hello, and welcome to the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Casey Baum, and I hope that you are all having a wonderful week, a wonderful Wednesday. Today is July 8th, and I thought that since my last episode I reviewed Hamilton, it would be fun for today to have a solely musical episode. I'm kind of in a more musical mood after watching that adaptation, and there's a lot of movie musicals out, and that's basically what I've watched this week. So the first film is actually another film that Shub has already reviewed called Eurovision, the Story of Fire Saga on Netflix right now. So I hope that you like the differing opinions, much like I did with Elizabeth and Da Five Bloods, because I have some other opinions. I love to talk about it, and I think it's always fascinating to hear some different sides of a film. And then my weekly watch this week is Moulin Rouge. It's a film I had never seen before, so I got to watch that for the first time, and I'm excited to talk about it. And then finally, my weekly recommendation is called Sing Street. It's one of my favorite movies to come out recently, and honestly just one of my favorite movies in general. It's a much more recent movie musical, so I'm very excited to recommend that to you guys. And then finally, my last segment is top 5 movie musicals, because, let's just keep the trend going. And specifically, I thought I would run down my top 5 musicals that were not adapted from the stage. So these are original movie musicals from film. Some of them have been adapted into stage plays afterwards, but things like Phantom of the Opera, Grease, that doesn't count for this list. But yeah, that's the episode. I hope that you guys are in a sing-songy spirit, because we're going to start with Eurovision. Alright, so the Eurovision Song Contest, the Story of Fire Saga, follows 2 Icelandic singers, Lars and Sigrid, played by Will Ferrell and Rachel McAdams, as they, by luck of the draw, make it into the Eurovision Song Contest and try their best to win it all for the approval of their friends and family, as well as the recognition of Iceland. So like I said, Shub already reviewed this movie. Please go check out his review. He has some excellent thoughts about it, and we have fairly similar opinions on it. I will say that I liked it significantly less than he did, and let's talk about why. I was not a very big fan of this movie. I will say that I enjoyed it for the most part. I don't think that it is a very good movie. I didn't have a terrible time with it. It's by no means, offensive. I didn't waste my 2 hours on this movie, but I wouldn't recommend it necessarily. I think there are better comedies out there. I think there are better musicals out there. But let's talk about some of the reasons why that is. And starting with the screenplay, I said that it was 2 hours. It is far too long. The film itself is kind of a sketch. This tends to be the case with a lot of Will Ferrell movies, and a lot of just SNL alum tend to do movies that are more or less a big sketch. And this is one of those. 2 Scandinavian singers with, in this film, very, very shaky accents, but normally maybe a goofy accent for the American listener or viewer. And they're trying to be famous singers. That's just kind of the premise of a sketch comedy routine. And so it is not worth 2 hours. I think there are ways that they could have made it worth 2 hours. And I think there are a couple different directions that they could have gone with this movie that would have warranted that runtime, maybe. And they didn't go in any of those directions. So the screenplay overall, I believe is probably the worst aspect of the film. It's kind of a mess. There's a lot of different plot points that are introduced early on or introduced throughout the movie that either get completely thrown to the wayside or subverted for a cheap gag, basically. It spends its time taking plot points that you may expect the movie to go and then subverting them pretty quickly, pretty immediately. And then the way that they subvert it takes the initial plot line and throws that out the window completely. So early on, there's a point where I thought the movie was going in one way, did not go that way, and I have to say that almost every time that I thought that, because it actually happened a couple times, the way that they could have gone was probably better. It's a little bit tonally confused. It starts out as a pretty clear comedy, but I have to say that none of the jokes land, at least for me. There's a couple running gags that I think are funny on the surface, but didn't actually make me laugh out loud. I did watch this movie alone, so take that with a grain of salt. It's a much easier experience to laugh when you're laughing with people, of course. But this, as far as I'm aware, was always slated for Netflix, and so it wasn't a big theatrical release that you would have had the benefit of being in a large crowd for that. But regardless whether the jokes work for you or not, it starts out as a comedy pretty overtly, and it also starts out as a musical, but after a certain time frame, probably within the first 30-45 minutes, they drop the music being a large aspect of it. The songs come more so in the beginning and the end. In the middle, it's a little bit lacking. It's a little bit empty, so it kind of loses the whole musical aspect. It also tries to be emotionally heavy and pretty emotionally resonant, but that doesn't work either. And there's also a point where it looks like it's going in the direction of maybe a murder mystery, which I actually think would have been the best direction for this movie to take. Take, for example, Game Night or the most recent Lovebirds, where it's sort of a one-day thing. There's something going on. Two people are trapped in the middle of it for some random reason, and I actually think that would have been the most interesting way for this to go, because they do some weird things with romance that doesn't really work, and they have two sort of antagonist-type characters that are supposed to be foils for the two main characters that come in to stir problems, and then that gets abandoned within about 20 minutes, and then they become sort of allies, almost. So there's really no direction for these characters. A lot of the characters have motivations that are more so told to us than shown. That's a big problem with this movie. There is no point where anything is really shown, other than I would say Rachel McAdams' performance. She does a pretty darn good job with the limit and constraints that she has. But mostly the characters, I would say, Will Ferrell is one. The father, who is played by Pierce Brosnan, also has a pretty clear motivation, but that is told to us rather than shown. And because of that, when that motivation gets changed or gets subverted, it doesn't feel warranted, and honestly feels like it either comes out of nowhere or doesn't make any sense, or the motivation was just kind of flimsy to begin with. A lot of these plot points, too, are very absurd, which tends to be the case in sort of these goofy, crazy comedies. It's never going for realism, and there's no problem with that. I think absurdity tends to work in its favor for films like this. But in this case, the absurdity either goes too far or goes in a direction that is so where the characters are so oblivious to what is going on that it becomes very, very frustrating. It's so over the top that you actually get a little bit upset with how these characters are responding to it, and not in a good way. And then I think another moment in the screenplay that just didn't sit right with me was the opening. The beginning of the film is a very boring cliche that starts out sort of in the past as a flashback, and you get a young interpretation of the main character goofing off and getting scrutinized for it. And it doesn't really add anything. It's where the film is trying to tell us why these characters feel this way. It doesn't actually add anything to the story. A lot of that could have been introduced in another opening scene that happened in modern day that is not as cliche. Then immediately after, there's a scene in modern day where it's the two main characters having this very lavish music video with one of their songs that then gets interrupted, and you find out that it was just kind of in their head and their imagination, and that also doesn't serve much to the story. If anything, it feels like that music video was solely a promotional tactic. It's called Volcano Song, and it's one of the main marketing ploys that this film has used, and so ultimately it doesn't feel like it was anything other than maybe for the trailer or for a promotional moment. So, not my favorite. Another thing that happens in a lot of these movies, these types of movies that are full of sketch comics and whatnot, written by a lot of people like that, is there's a lot of improv. And usually I am not one to really condone that. I think it can work, and there are a lot of talented improv comedians, but sometimes it goes on too long and the bits don't work and it gets a little exhausted. In this film, though, there is little to no improv as far as I can tell, and any improv moments come from a very scripted scene that then can that Will Ferrell mostly can just kind of throw out different versions of the same line. And because of that, a lot of these comedic scenes sort of fall flat and feel very scripted. My main takeaway from this movie is that it feels flat on almost every level. So now let's, I'm gonna be a little more positive for a second. Some of the acting is quite good. I would say Rachel McAdams is actually very good given what she has. Dan Stevens, who's best known for Legion, plays somewhat of the antagonist, but also a little bit of maybe a love interest. A little bit confusing as to where his character is going, but he does fairly well. But I would say that maybe is the extent of it. There's also a fun cameo by Graham Norton, who is a British talk show host who plays the commentator. He's quite good. He's playing himself, so there's not really any need to do anything all that large for the film. But I would say that he is sort of a fun standout. McAdams and Stevens are fairly good. For a film that takes place in Europe, none of the accents are great. Some are better than others. Will Ferrell's is not all that good. I would also say Will Ferrell's strong suit tends to be with improv and sketch comedy, so in a film that feels very scripted and tries to be more emotionally impactful than maybe it should be, his performance is not nearly as strong as somebody else. He's a co-writer for this film, so it feels as though the part was written for him, but it would have been, I think, more interesting if they had casted somebody else. Additionally, his singing voice is the weakest of everybody, and that's part of the gag, but it's not a very good gag. If anything, all of the other singers are either professional singers or actors who are good at singing, completely outshine him, and the gag of him not being very good is almost undermined by the fact that he wrote, in the world of the story, his character Lars wrote the songs that him and Sigrid, their band Fire Saga, play, and the songs are actually quite good. So he is talented, and that kind of undermines the fact that he is portrayed as not being talented, particularly with singing. So I would have wanted to either get a different singer to voice him or maybe just a different actor, because Rachel McAdams' singing voice in this is fantastic. And I thought that it was Rachel McAdams the whole time. I was like, hold on, when is Rachel McAdams releasing original music? Because this is phenomenal. She was my favorite singer in the whole thing. Turns out it was not Rachel McAdams. It was kind of a mix of her voice and an Icelandic singer named Molly Sandin, who is amazing. Her songs are fantastic. Completely elevates all of the songs in this. Because I will say, as a musical, the songs are quite good. The songs are actually very good. Will Ferrell's addition to some of the songs feels a little bit out of place in a song that should be very good. Is not as good as it could be. Again, I understand that it's the joke of it, but I think there are better ways to portray that joke. And particularly in scenes where they have other Eurovision contestants, maybe some cameos, he feels very out of place in that. But Molly Sandin is amazing, and the songs are great. I have been listening to some of the songs this morning. I think they're very, very good. So that is a very big standout for this film. Additionally, moving on to maybe some production design, there is some pretty poor visual effects in this, some pretty bad green screen, and in a film that the script feels so flat, having the backgrounds and some of the visual effects, and it's pretty easy to tell that they're on a green screen, therefore making it feel flat does not enhance anything. You could have had maybe some moments where there was some more extravagant scenery, especially in a movie that takes place in Europe and all over Europe. Realistically, you could have had a lot of very beautiful background imagery that is kind of just not color graded very well, pretty flat looking, pretty plain looking, and then having it put on a green screen makes it even more flat. So in a movie that is supposed to sort of embrace European culture or embrace some European backdrops, none of it really looks like it should. And especially in a movie that, for Iceland, it's supposed to kind of exemplify some of the positives of living in a small town or living in some place so beautiful, particularly exemplified by that final song, and you don't really get the chance to see any of it. You see a lot of the people, and you see some exteriors that are a little bit more interesting than maybe if it were to take place in the United States, but again, none of it is graded very well. All of it feels very plain and very boring, and when the scenes are also somewhat boring, it doesn't help its cause. As far as the production design goes, though, a lot of the effort, it feels as though, went into the costumes, which I will say were fairly good. It seems as though a lot of the characters had certain colors that were coordinated with them. A lot of the Icelandic, or the two Icelandic singers were wearing white a lot of the time, seemingly to portray maybe some of their innocence in regards to the Eurovision song and some of their motivations. The Russian character, Dan Stevens, was wearing a lot of red, maybe to simplify his lust or maybe some of his internalized anger for some of the characters and some of the other things going on with his plotline. But then sometimes that gets thrown out the window just for an extravagant costume. So it seems like there was a vision for it that sometimes gets thrown to the wayside, but overall was fairly good. Another aesthetically focused criticism is for the cinematography. There isn't really much, like the green screen and the backgrounds. Again, there's no clear vision for the cinematography. All of it feels very flat. A lot of comedies like this are more focused on the story, so it tends to go kind of 1-2 shot over the shoulder and a wide, and then cut between all of those in a functional way. So that works when the comedy is really good because you're solely focused on that and don't have to really be focused on the aesthetic of it all. I would say the aesthetic should enhance it, but in this case, it doesn't really matter all that much. But in this film, because the story and the comedy is lacking, the cinematography is much more apparent and fairly plain. There's also some inconsistencies I found with eyeline and people looking at each other, and I don't know whether that was the cinematographer's fault or the editing's fault, so I don't want to particularly scrutinize any certain crew member. I just think overall that aspect of the film didn't work nearly as well as I think that it should have. Focusing on the editing, though, a lot of the scenes I think were too long, should have been cut maybe 2 or 3 minutes shorter. A lot of them have bits that are going on far too long that don't necessarily work in the grand scheme of things at all, whether the bit was going on for 30 seconds or 3 minutes. That would have cut the runtime down a lot, would have made it feel a lot less empty. And so as far as the editing goes, I don't think that is nearly as focused as it could be. And finally, my last takeaway is for the sound and the score. Like I said, the music is very, very good. There is one scene called the Song Along, which is pretty clearly just a rip-off of the riff-off from Pitch Perfect, without the emotional stakes from Pitch Perfect. So it's really just to show some cameos of some former Eurovision contestants, which is fine, but I would have liked those cameos to come in a much more poignant moment and maybe spread out a little bit more. The other thing, though, is that the score kind of tells us what to feel. I had said earlier about how most of the motivations and most of the character beats are told to us rather than shown to us, and most of the emotion that we're supposed to be feeling is told to us through the score. So the story is not strong enough to say, hey, you should be feeling emotional right here, you should be sad, you should be happy here. Instead, the underlying score is going to be melancholy or upbeat, so that we know how to feel. And I don't think that I think that it works. I mean, you feel that. That's sort of how effective a score can be, but it shouldn't be coming from the score. The score should solely supplement it as opposed to being the only perpetrator of that emotion. So, overall, I think you can tell I was not a big fan of this movie. I didn't hate my time watching it. There were some enjoyable moments. I laughed a few times. The songs were definitely very enjoyable. So if you're looking for something light to maybe have on in the background, I think that would be okay, but I do think there are better musicals. I think there are better comedies. So I'm going to give this film a strong 3 out of 10. Not my favorite. Some positive aspects, but overall not all that great. So that's Eurovision Song Contest, The Story of Fire Saga. And next up, I'm going to have my weekly watch, which is Moulin Rouge, and then I'm going to be talking about Sing Street, my weekly recommendation, and finally I'm going to run down my top 5 movie musicals. But for right now, we're going to take a quick break.
Want to know the latest and hottest music hitting the airwaves? Don't be left out. Listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Music Podcast. It keeps you on the loop with everything you need to know from pop, rock, hip-hop, and the top 40. And we'll throw in news of your favorite artists, concert and tour dates, and so much more. Listen no further, because this is the gold standard in music podcast.
Welcome back to the GSMC Movie Podcast. I'm your host, Casey Baum. If you are just tuning in or skipping around a little bit, I have given my review on Eurovision, one of the newest Will Ferrell comedies streaming right now on Netflix. I am now going to give a review on Moulin Rouge, and finally I'm going to give a review on Sing Street, and then stay tuned until the very end of the episode where I run down my top 5 movie musicals of all time. So Moulin Rouge, this is a movie I was fairly excited about watching. I had never seen it before. It's from 2001. It stars Ewan McGregor and Nicole Kidman. It's directed by Baz Luhrmann, coming right off the heels of Romeo plus Juliet, which was a box office success, and I think the studio gave him a lot of freedom to run wild with this film, one of his first and only original films. And I usually give kind of my own rundown of the plot, but there's a plot on IMDb that's a poet falls for a beautiful courtesan whom a jealous duke covets. And I think that puts it pretty simply. That's basically what goes on. So it takes place in the year 1900, or at least around the year 1900 in Paris, France. Obviously, it takes place at the Moulin Rouge, which is a real place but has been somewhat fictionalized and in general kind of mythologized within... Mythologize, is that a word? Maybe not. But within kind of pop culture at the time of making, and a lot of historians have done research on the Moulin Rouge. So it's a pretty well-known place. Whether or not all of it is legend or not is sort of up for interpretation, and that's something that I think Baz Luhrmann takes advantage of. Overall, I did enjoy this movie. I didn't really know what to expect. I knew that it was a movie musical. I knew that it was extravagant. That's kind of how Baz Luhrmann works. I didn't know that all of the songs were, or most of the songs were not original songs. Some of them were, but they were written by famous pop artists at the time. So this is 2001, turn of the century, and I think that is the turn of the century. I think is an important aspect of the film because it takes place at a different turn of the century. So I think it's trying to take some of the themes that were happening between the 90s and the early 2000s, and have some of the events that were happening from the turn of the 1800s to the 1900s, kind of combine the themes and the events happening to sort of elevate both of them, which I think is very fascinating. So, like most times, let's start with the screenplay. Baz Luhrmann, for those of you who don't know, he directed Romeo plus Juliet. He also directed The Great Gatsby. He is a very extravagant director, known for his lavish costumes and just the over-the-top nature of most of his films. So his emphasis isn't normally on screenplay, as far as I can tell. A lot of his films are based on other properties with kind of his own spin on it, or if not, Moulin Rouge being an example of this, are heavily inspired by former works. So in this case, it's pretty clearly inspired by Hamlet, some early 20th century theater and novels. But the screenplay is actually quite good. It's a little bit, I I don't want to say cliche. It's just a similar structure to a lot of love stories, a lot of famous theater pieces. But I think a lot of that is intentional because it has a much larger focus on emotion. It is not really focused all that much on the story. It makes the story very transparent. Given that there is a play within the movie, it's fairly meta, but you know what some of the events happening in the film are going to be because either the film has shown us or the play within the film is doing. So it is not supposed to be narratively complex necessarily. It's not making you guess which way it's going. It might guess how you're going to get somewhere as opposed to where you're going, but overall, I think the emphasis is mostly on emotions, which I think is a benefit for the film because of the fact that it's a fairly traditional story that you kind of know what's going on. Some of this is because of the other aspects of the film, but it's never boring. All of the music in the film is very high energy most of the time, and it works to enhance the story. All of it is spaced out pretty well. None of it is overloaded in one place or the other, so it's evened out throughout most of the film, which is a nice touch. Some of the scenes or plot points kind of diverts expectations a little bit. That's sort of the way of saying how we're going to get there as opposed to where we're going, because we kind of know where we're going the whole time. So that is nice. It is not all that often necessarily, and some of the expectations that get subverted are through characters as opposed to story. This tends to be the case with a lot of musicals, whether it be on screen or on stage. There tends to be like one or two pointless scenes. Like they're not totally pointless. Like they're mostly, I get that they're for the motivation of certain characters, but it's usually like the side characters or the villain plus a side character singing about a motivation that we kind of already know about or a plot point we kind of already know about. In theater, a lot of times it's to let the main characters get a costume change or get a break. In film, it doesn't necessarily serve that same purpose, which is why I'm somewhat confused that it happens sometimes. Maybe it's just to portray that this is really kind of a theater stage show put to film. But in this case, there is a scene with Madonna's Like a Virgin with one of the side characters and the central antagonist of the film, which isn't a bad scene by any means, but it just kind of feels out of place and not necessary. So, talking about the characters, the acting is also very good. A lot of the acting is very over the top, very grandiose, which is something that Baz Luhrmann obviously likes to do, so that works very well. I will say that the two main characters, Nicole Kidman and Ewan McGregor, Christian and Satine, are less over the top. They are much more grounded, and I think that is intentional to focus on the emotions of those two characters and have all of the side characters be crazy and over the top, so we're not they're more caricatures, so we don't necessarily care about their motivations or their character arcs. They're more there to supplement the main characters. Other than, obviously, I think the main antagonist of the film, the Duke, who is played by Richard Roxburgh. So that's kind of a nice touch to have all the side characters be super over the top and crazy because it adds to the fun of the movie. But we still get that grounded look at the emotion of some of the main characters. I think that silliness from the side characters is also there to water down maybe some of the heavier emotions, because there are some fairly heavy things that happen in this film, whether it be death or disease or sexual exploitation. There's kind of a lot of different themes going on that are heavier than the film likes to portray them as, and I think overall it's because this is supposed to be a fun movie. It's supposed to be a lighthearted movie. I think overall you're just supposed to come out of this film feeling good, feeling energized, and so having the side characters water down some of the heavier moments, the heavier emotions, is to keep the fun lightheartedness of the film going, because overall, if you look at just the definition and the film itself, it is a tragedy, but it's not supposed to be a tragedy that is emotionally exhausting. It's supposed to be a tragedy that is ultimately enjoyable to watch. So I think that's somewhat of where the side silliness characters come from that may not have as deep character motivations, but are still important to the story. you also can't talk about any Baz Luhrmann film without talking about the production design. So obviously the production design, whether it be the costumes or the settings or the backdrops, are absolutely extravagant and grandiose and very, very impressive. And it really just kind of heightens the extremity of the film and the intensity and just the overall craziness of the film. So having the costumes and the backdrops lean into that is obviously something that is beneficial to the film and just kind of a nice touch that doesn't always happen in films that are just sort of a lot of mainstream films that are just very story-driven. Some of the production design might just get thrown to the wayside, or just there's not nearly as large of an emphasis on it. And I would say Baz Luhrmann puts more of an emphasis on it, and to some that may be a downside. But to me, I think that is a general positive of the film. In particular with this film, because it takes place in 1900, but there is a lot of I'll talk about this a little bit later, obviously, but the music and just the sensibilities of the film are pretty 20th century, late 20th, early 21st century. You get a mix of that in the costuming, which is nice. There is you are able to tell that these are costumes that are inspired by and a lot of times take from sort of the 19th, 20th century, turn of the century wardrobe for sort of burlesque type shows, but are also inspired and influenced by some of the extravagant celebrity gowns and things that might be shown at a red carpet at the turn of the more modern century. So you get a mix of the two, which I think works really well in its favor with some of the themes and just the events that transpire throughout the film. So the costuming, there was obviously a strong focus on that, and then for the backdrops, it is similar to the costuming, where it is mostly supposed to be a reflection of the late 19th century, but you get a little bit of some influences of some more modern things that are weaved into it, and the intensity and over-the-top nature of all the backdrops is ultimately supposed to coincide and parallel the intensity of the emotions. So there really is a reason for the extravagance, which isn't always the case in films that are just so crazy over the top, but I think that the story parallels it and they work really well in tandem. Moving on to some more aesthetic aspects and some more filmmaking techniques, the cinematography is fairly unique, I would say. There's a lot of emphasis on strong movements. Particularly, there's a lot of emphasis on spinning and moving in and out with characters, really to make you almost feel as though you are a dancer in the film. So it emphasizes all of the extravagance as to say that maybe you would be in this scenario as well. So I think there is a very clear choice happening to make you a member of the film, which is obviously super fun in a film that's super fun. And so the camera, I think, really works well, has that focus on movement. Sometimes I would say that it's a little bit disorienting, a little bit dizzying, so definitely be aware of that going into it. But there are also some quieter moments in the film where the camera is a little bit more steady, a little bit more objective. So I think that it uses this crazy movement style to its limit, and still is beneficial to the film. The editing also leans into this. It's very chaotic. It never really, both the camera and the editing never really let you focus on one thing, unless it really is telling you to. So the language of the film really emphasizes what you need to be watching or what you need to be seeing. And when it's moving all over the place, it's more of just like, hey, look at everything that's going on. Isn't this crazy? Isn't this fun? Which obviously is not a rejection of the story. It actually is a parallel to the story, like I said earlier, but it still is crazy and over the top. And that's a technique that I feel like sometimes is or should be used in films that are a little bit more boring, because then you are still having fun whether or not the story is a little bit slower. But in this case, everything is over the top and crazy, and I think that's just something that Baz Luhrmann enjoys doing, and that's really his clear vision. So every aspect of the film is influenced by his vision. As far as the sound goes, can't talk about this movie without talking about the music. The songs are all songs that are from either I don't think there's a song that is like later than the 70s, so it's mostly like 80s and 90s songs, because this is 2001, so there are obviously no 2000s songs, but they are all mixed together, and the genre of some of them are changed to more reflect the style of early 20th century music. And a lot of times songs are combined that don't actually have much to do with each other except for themes, and the genre is all over the place. So changing the genre to be more reflective of the setting of the film, I think works extremely well. And some of them are really fun. I particularly really like the Smells Like Teen Spirit moment, which I think is a very fun part of the film. And then the love sort of, what do you call it? Not montage. Combination of all the songs. There's a word for it. I can't think of it off the top of my head. But all of those works really well. And what's nice in this too is that none of it feels gimmicky. Sometimes films that lean into other songs from other mediums that you might associate with something else feel as though it's solely to get you invested based on your understanding of the song and not from your understanding of the film. But none of it feels that way here. All of it seems to reflect the themes of the film, and the film already kind of grabs you in enough that it doesn't really matter. And I actually think the extra textual context of some of those songs is supposed to make you aware of the fact that this is a film, this is a play within a play within a film, and it's really supposed to be a much more transparent view of film and how it can make you feel all these emotions with telling you that it's going to make you feel all these emotions, which is a very cool thing going on there. So I've talked a lot about the directing just throughout all this, so there's not much more I have to say. Baz Luhrmann likes to do the over-the-top stuff. He likes to do some tragic love stories, but kind of spice them up and make them a little bit more fun and enjoyable and kind of meet them with optimism, which is nice. I think my last takeaway from this film is that it is a little bit outdated. It's always a little bit odd to see films that are relatively recent. I mean, now this film is 20 years old, but it is a little outdated. There are some cultural, racial things that are probably not as accurate or sensitive these days. Some of it I think still works in context of the film given the time period and the opulence and extravagance of the film, but I don't think it works as well for our modern sensibilities. And there are also some characters that probably should be played by other members of a specific community as opposed to just your typical Hollywood actor. So I think that's my last takeaway. It's a little bit outdated, doesn't necessarily take away from the film, but something to for sure be aware of. And I don't think it is a downside to say, hey, be critical of a film that you enjoy. I think ultimately that should enhance your experience of the film. So something to be aware of. But overall, I did enjoy this movie. There are some moments where I thought that the level of intensity was a little bit too much, maybe a little bit too cliche at times and sometimes disorienting. So my rating of it is a little bit more personal for me. So that's kind of it's a soft 7. So it's good. It's not necessarily great in my mind, but a lot of people love this movie and I can totally see why, because there are a lot of clear choices, strong choices that are very positive to the film at large. So that's Moulin Rouge. That's my weekly watch. And now I'm going to give my weekly recommendation, which is Sing Street, and I am very excited for that one. And then stay tuned until the very end where I talk about my top 5 movie musicals ever. But right now, we're going to take another quick break.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Movie Podcast. I'm your host, Casey Baum. If you are just tuning in or skipping around a little bit, I have given my review of Eurovision, one of the newest films streaming on Netflix. I've also given a review of Moulin Rouge, my weekly watch, and now I'm going to give my weekly recommendation of Sing Street. And stay tuned until the last segment where I talk about my top 5 movie musicals. So, Sing Street, this is another one of my favorite movies that I absolutely adore. I'm absolutely in love with, and it is criminally underrated. It has a fairly prominent, I would say, cult following, that there are a lot of people who have seen it. It was on Netflix for a time, so people have seen it there. I have a special relationship with this film. I went to go see it pretty much on its opening with my mom for her birthday, because it is mostly 80s music or 80s inspired music. So she loved it, I loved it, and that's one of the reasons I love it, but it is also just a very, very good film. So the premise of the film follows Connor, who is a teenage boy living in 1980s Dublin, Ireland, and he gets transferred to an all-boys Christian school but meets the girl who lives across the street and starts a band to try to win her attention and affection. The poster says, boy meets girl, girl unimpressed, boy starts band. And that's pretty much it. That's kind of what goes on in the film. So, to be completely honest, it is not necessarily a super original film. The setting makes it a little bit different, but a film that is a coming-of-age story that involves a boy trying to get the attention of a girl that has a prominent focus on music has been done time and time again. But because of the fact that this movie is met with so much care and so much time, and overall the quality of every aspect of this film, particularly the music and the story, enhances everything. And so instead of making it kind of cliche, it kind of more leans towards relatable. The entire film is kind of relatable, I would think, to anybody, and with just sort of the emotions that and themes that get kind of thrown out through this film. So it's not a very original story, but because it's of such high quality, the lack of originality focuses itself on the relatability of it. And so a lot of it also is that the characters are so strong. So in stories like this, that is such a well understood story, the characters could just kind of be archetypes, not much could be going on there. But in this film, all of the characters, particularly some of the more main side characters, have very strong motivations and pretty strong flaws, which is what makes us fall in love with characters and what makes it relatable. Because nobody in this film is perfect, which in a coming-of-age story is very realistic. All of it is told through the eyes of Connor, our lead character, and so he gets to kind of first start grappling with the flaws of his family and his older brother, and then subsequently the relationship that he is focusing on. And so a lot of these much heavier topics, whether it be addiction or loss, or even trauma, are hinted at, and it's something that Connor is sort of first understanding and first exploring for the first time. So they're not stated as overtly. It's something that he has to kind of either infer or get a very general first understanding of, and then therefore can meet it with a little bit more optimism because it's sort of new to him and he hasn't necessarily gone through all of these experiences, but they're only going to enhance his character, which is really how it feels to be younger and to be first confronted with a lot of these much more serious topics. So in that, it is very relatable. Moving on to the people that portray the characters, they are all fantastic. It is mainly a group of unknown actors. There was a large open casting call for people all around Ireland to play a lot of these characters. The most famous character is Aidan Gillen, who played Smallfoot on Game of Thrones. Littlefoot? I haven't watched Littlefoot. Littlefinger. Oh, whoops. I'm sorry, I don't watch Game of Thrones. But he's the most famous in this film. And then the lead romantic love interest is played by Lucy Boynton, who went on to be in Bohemian Rhapsody. So she was not famous at the time either. So it's a cast of largely unknowns, and because of that, the focus is on the acting. It's not focused on the star power. So all of the acting feels very genuine, very relatable. They're all playing the age that they are. So none of it feels forced. None of it feels like they are too old or too maybe mature to be playing such immature characters. Because what's nice is that these characters are immature, but are met with such genuineness and care that you can understand where they're coming from and can really root for their growth. And so all of the actors too are ultimately just so charming, and every character has charisma that is off the charts. So it's really just a joy to watch. So they all have these flaws, but everybody has flaws, and so really focusing on the flaws and how they can maybe improve it, and having these characters come from such a genuine place that you can understand why they have these flaws really is a testament to both the acting and the screenplay. What's nice about this film is that because it's a musical, you can't talk about any aspect of this film without talking about the influence of the music, because the music and the songs, whether it be the original songs or some of the songs from the 80s, play such an integral role that you can't understand any other facet of this film without first dissecting some of the songs and some of the influences. So I would say about half the songs in the film are original, that are sung by all of the actors in the film, and are diegetic, so they're important to the story and take place in the story. They're not going on sort of just for the audience to understand. But then there's also about half the soundtrack is done by other artists from the 80s. So there's The Cure, a-ha, Duran Duran, a lot of musicians like that. And what is really cool is that a lot of the film is broken up with Connor first hearing some of these artists and then influencing his style, whether it be the songs or his personality or his costuming, is kind of influenced by the musician that he just discovered. Which is such a nice, careful touch, because it really emphasizes the experimentation that goes on in adolescence and really trying to discover yourself through other people. And so all of the production design really reflects that. So particularly the costuming moves pretty quickly throughout the influences. So it is always brought on by somebody that we are hearing and we are understanding that Connor has heard for the first time. And then his style changes a lot of times either for a gag or a pretty clear character beat that then becomes very emotionally resonant. So that's such a nice touch, a very original touch to this film. And a lot of times the experimentation and change of characters doesn't happen as much in coming of age stories, because you want to focus on a character and say this is who they are and this is who they're gonna be. But in teenage adolescent years, you're moving around so fast, you're changing so quickly, and you're really just trying to figure out who you are. And Sing Street exemplifies that in a way that I've never really seen in another coming of age film. Additionally, all of the costuming has these very visually vibrant, intriguing costumes that are juxtaposed with boring gray backdrops, that really shows all of the vibrance and excitement in Connor and everybody else's life comes from their inner selves and maybe something that they're seeing on TV, because they don't find their environment exciting at all. Because a lot of people would go to Ireland and find it beautiful. I would say most people would, who isn't from Ireland, but Connor's been growing up in this town forever, and so it feels much more drab and much weaker, and so all of the costuming is so much more exciting and pops significantly more. Moving on to the cinematography. The cinematography is solid. There's nothing all that innovative that is happening in the cinematography. I wouldn't say that it's functional, strictly, because there are some nice shots, some fairly wonderful wide shots, some really, really nice framing. But the camera doesn't do anything all that intriguing unless you're talking about the music video parts of the movie. And I think that ultimately that is also intentional, because it really emphasizes the excitement of the music videos. And you can see that John Carney, who directed this film, directs it like a song or like music. He has a very strong understanding of music, and so there are moments that go up and so the story itself goes up and down in a way that flows really well. It doesn't feel jarring, and so the camera, I think, does that as well, where it has these much more exciting moments that take place maybe even in the imagination of Connor and his friends, and then sometimes where it's just a lot more simplistic. So the camera, I wouldn't even say is the weakest part. It's just fun. Like, it's good. Like, it does what it needs to do, and focuses much more on the imagination and the imaginative parts of Connor's mind. The editing has some really solid pacing. The structure, because the structure is so coherent and traditional, having the moments where Connor changes his personality, and then therefore the film kind of changes its influence, and the song has an influence of all of these artists. The editing makes that work. It flows really nicely. The pacing works. All of those moments that have different influences are kind of structured in the same way and last for about the same amount of time. There's also some fun visual gags that happen with some of the editing and some of the pacing. So I would say that the editing is actually very strong in this film. And talking about the music and the songs, this film would not be nearly as good if the songs weren't as good. The singing is beautiful. The lyrics are poetic. It takes all these influences from different artists, but fits coherently. The themes of the songs really give you an understanding of what's going on in the story, something that is really necessary for musicals. And this film is such a secret musical. Like, you know it's a musical, you're listening to the songs, but the story is so strong that you're like, oh, this is just a part of the world. The songs are really just a part of the story. And so I cannot rave enough about this soundtrack, because it also, like, I'm not a big 80s fan as far as music goes, but it takes these influences and makes them a little bit more modern, but they would also have worked in this time period. So it's really, really enjoyable to everybody. I cannot exaggerate the fact that I listen to this soundtrack all the time. The songs work solely on their own, but they also work in tandem to the story. And so my final takeaways from this film is that I have watched this film plenty of times, and it is one of my favorite feel-good movies. Like, I always feel good after watching it. I always want to start a band after watching it, but I also just always feel happy, always feel good. It's fun to watch. It's really great for any age. The whole film is met with optimism and care, and you can really tell how much both the cast and the crew really, really care about this story and had so much fun making it. So I am in love with Sing Street. I'm going to give it a soft 10 out of 10. It's not quite my favorite film, so it's not maybe as strong. So it's not a strong 10 out of 10. It's a soft 10 out of 10 because I love it. It's so cute. It's so fun. So that's Sing Street. I highly recommend it. Watch it wherever you can, particularly if you're feeling down. It's a great feel-good movie. So now the final segment is my top 5 movie musicals. I'm super excited, but right now we're going to take one final break.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blanks and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
Welcome back to the GSMC Movie Podcast. I'm your host, Casey Baum. If you are just tuning in or skipping around a little bit, I have given 3 different reviews. I have given my review of Eurovision, one of the newest films streaming right now on Netflix. I have also given a review of Moulin Rouge, and then my weekly recommendation this week was Sing Street. And now we're into my final segment, which is my top 5 movie musicals of all time. There's a couple limits to this list. These are movie musicals that were not Broadway or just theater shows first. They are strictly made for film that maybe got made into musicals later on. Because all three of the musicals that I've reviewed today were for film first. They are strictly movies, and then maybe have gotten made into things otherwise afterwards. Like any top 5 list, there are some pretty big movies that I probably haven't seen. For this list, Singing in the Rain is probably a big one. Probably would be on this list otherwise. Also, none of the films from this episode will count, so Sing Street would be up number 1 for sure, and Moulin Rouge might be on this list as well, but I've already reviewed them, so I'm not going to put them on this list. And finally, this segment is going to be a little bit shorter than normal, probably because most of these movies I haven't seen in a little while. They're movies that I remember loving quite a bit, I know to be very good, but it's been maybe a minute since I've seen some of them, so can't talk as lengthy about some of these movies. But let's get started with number 5. And number 5 is kind of just pure enjoyment. It's such a fun, feel-good movie. It's maybe not the best movie of all time, but it's Pitch Perfect. I really like Pitch Perfect. I remember seeing this movie in theaters. I remember going to see it. My mom is a big a cappella fan, which is why we went. It's so goofy. It's such a good popcorn movie. It's nice to have a blockbuster movie that isn't like an action movie, because this really is a movie theater movie. The music works so well in that space. It's a really fun movie to watch in an environment with a big crowd. And so it's a great theater popcorn movie that works as a summer kind of blockbuster that isn't crazy intense and maybe a little bit more family friendly in some ways. It has some very strong comedic actors that all have great charm, are very fun to watch, and the comedy chops overall are just fantastic. It's also like all the singers are fantastic in this movie overall. I love Ben Platt, went on to do Dear Evan Hansen. So the singers in this are fantastic, and all of it is very, very charming. And then it also just doesn't take itself too seriously. It's silly, it's goofy, it knows that a cappella is goofy, it knows that college in general is goofy, and so it's just kind of like comedies can still take themselves too seriously sometimes, and it's really nice that Pitch Perfect doesn't do that. It really leans into the silliness and the goofiness of it all, and I think it works really well. It's a very enjoyable film. So number 4 on this list is Enchanted, which is kind of a fun one. I had forgotten about it for a while, but it's kind of a parody satire on Disney films, but made by Disney, so take that with a grain of salt. But the acting in it is phenomenal. Amy Adams can do anything, and this is pretty early on in Amy Adams' career, and she really gives it her all. She really leans into the silliness and the caricature of a Disney princess, and having that juxtaposed with the environment of New York City is just so entertaining to watch. It uses the iconography and mythology of Disney really to its benefit, with some of the events that happen and some of the characters that are in this film that you kind of know. It's nice to put characters or archetypes that you know into contexts that are so different, and I think in this case it really, really works. And the music is enjoyable and memorable, and the film just overall is a lot of fun, and it's very silly, and yeah, it's fun. The thing about movie musicals is that a lot of them are just fun, but the next 3 that we're getting into are a little bit more serious and just very, very good films. So number 3, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about it, and I do like this film quite a bit, is Wizard of Oz. It's one of the first... Actually, I can't say that at all. It is not one of the first movie musicals. There are a lot of movie musicals before Wizard of Oz, but it was really innovative to the genre. It really reinvigorated some of the why the genre resonates with so many people, particularly after the Great Depression. It also was kind of when Technicolor was novel, so that's a really fun aspect of it. And even when color is such a common thing, using the sepia tones in the beginning and then turning it into a much more magical, colorful world is great for the story. Like, that's something that probably, if the movie were to get made today, wouldn't happen, but should. It's just such a... I think I take it for granted how well that enhances the story being told. So it's innovative. It's still very, very relatable, with some of the struggles both internally and externally with a lot of the characters that are in this film. The characters are also just so fun and lovable and iconic, and it's just seeped with imagination. L. Frank Baum, yeah, represent. One of us is doing big things. But he just created such a magical world, and it translates so well to film, and all of the filmmakers and all of the actors in this film did the same thing. So it's really still fun to watch, still very enjoyable, and I would say probably enjoyable to watch for the first time if you haven't seen it or want to show it to some of the young ones. So, love Wizard of Oz quite a bit. Number 2 is a much more recent addition to this list, La La Land. I think people were probably expecting it, given some of my taste previously, and also just talking about classic musicals, or talking about just classic stories being translated into modern day with some more modern sensibilities. This is such a clear example of it. The classic musical genre, and also just kind of the classic musical like tone and music of old Hollywood translated to modern day work really well. Yeah, there's not a lot to say about this that hasn't already been said, since I'm not doing a big review. It wears all of its influences on its sleeve, which is really nice. It doesn't try and pretend that it's something that it's not, but it takes all of those influences and kind of spins it in a new, much more modern direction. The colors are so beautiful in this film. It has such a phenomenal sequence at the end of the film with, talk about imagination. I mean, man, it's heartbreaking, the final sequence. And then I also like that there's such a big emphasis on dance in this. That's something that I think gets lost in a lot of movie musicals, both nowadays and even somewhat in the past. There's less of an emphasis on dance and much more of an emphasis on song. I think both for an enjoyment to the modern, just more mainstream audience, and then also for more of a marketing tactic. But there's a huge emphasis on dance in this film, and a lot of the dancers are very good. My only big gripe with this film is that it's a film about unknown artists. I would have loved if the main 2 actors were unknowns. I love Ryan Gosling and Emma Stone, don't get me wrong, they have wonderful chemistry, but I think it would have been really nice if we got some unknowns so we could really resonate with the story, and then also maybe some stronger singers. They're good singers, but just people that were maybe a little bit stronger. I don't know. That's my only gripe with it. I do love La La Land. I think it's a great film. And finally, number 1 on this list is The Lion King. I love The Lion King. I grew up with Disney. I think I grew up with Pixar maybe a little bit more, but I did grow up with classic Disney like a lot of people my age, and even just a lot of people in general. I mean, they've been around for so long. They have such a good catalog, and rewatching The Lion King, this is one that is just so strong. The story is strong because it's such a classic story. I mean, Hamlet, come on, Moulin Rouge did it too. And the characters are so iconic and enjoyable and memorable, and the songs are so good. All of the plot points and the beats work really, really well. There are some really great messages and it doesn't really treat its audience too young. It doesn't hammer in these messages like over your head. It's somewhat subtle, but it's also apparent enough that anybody can be aware of it. It was also just so formative for me, and I'm sure many other people. It's just overall such a strong movie. There's not a lot that I can say about it. It holds up quite well. Yeah, I love The Lion King. It's great. I think it's the best Disney animated musical film. Yeah, I don't think that's a hot take. Maybe it's a hot take. I used to think it was Mulan, but I rewatched Mulan recently, and it's not quite as good as I remember. I think I might review Mulan later on, so let me know if you want to. Because definitely tweet me and the other hosts, Elizabeth and Shub, at GSMC_movies. We love talking to you guys. We would love to hear some of your thoughts on some of these segments. So that's my episode. I hope that you enjoyed it. It's fun to talk about musicals. I think sometimes musicals don't get taken as seriously, both on stage and in film, and I think it's a fantastic genre that really has the ability to share some fantastic messages and some really great filmmaking. So today I have reviewed Eurovision, Moulin Rouge, Sing Street, and run down my top 5 movie musicals of all time. So thank you for listening to the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I would like to ask that you please remember to subscribe to the show and write a nice review, because that does really help us. Also, if you can please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. I have been your host, Casey Baum. Thank you for listening, and have a good night.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.